Most food has a clock running on it. A handful of things basically don't. Not last a while, genuinely stored, sealed, and forgotten for 25 years or longer, and still perfectly safe to eat when you open it. Today, we're counting down 15 foods that genuinely hit that mark, why the chemistry works, and, just as important, what you actually have to do to get those numbers, because almost every one of these depends entirely on how it's stored, not just what it is. We're counting down from 15 to number 1, and number 1 is the single most important item on this list, the one that outlasts everything else here and costs almost nothing. One ground rule before we start. Nearly every number in this video assumes proper storage, sealed against air and moisture, kept cool and dark, protected from pests. Take these same foods and leave them in the bag they came in, and you're looking at 1 to 2 years instead of 25. The food isn't doing the work alone. Let's get into it. Plain dried pasta, semolina, and water, nothing else, is one of the most forgiving pantry items there is. The best by date on the box usually says 1 to 2 years, but that's a quality estimate, not a safety line. Sealed properly against moisture and air, plain dried pasta comfortably reaches 25 to 30 years because there's essentially nothing in it for bacteria to work with. No fat to go rancid, no moisture to allow mold, just dry starch. The one version that doesn't make the cut is egg pasta, which contains real egg and therefore real fat. That one behaves much more like a 1 to 2 year product, and it's worth checking the ingredient list rather than assuming all pasta is the same. Very old pasta does change slightly. It can take a minute longer to cook and lose a little of its bite. That's a texture difference, not a safety one. The same distinction that runs through this entire list. One packaging detail worth knowing. Pasta usually comes in a cardboard box with a plastic window, which is fine for a year on a kitchen shelf, but does essentially nothing against pests or humidity long-term. Moving it into a sealed container is what converts the box's 1-year rating into the decades-long one. Regular milk lasts a week. Take the water out of it and it lasts decades. That's the entire principle behind almost every item on this list, and powdered milk is the clearest example of it. Properly sealed non-fat dry milk stores for 25 years or more, and it's genuinely useful. It reconstitutes for drinking, cooking, and baking, and it covers a real nutritional gap that plain grains and beans can't fill on their own. The critical detail is non-fat specifically. Whole milk powder still contains milk fat, which goes rancid on roughly a 2 to 5 year clock. The fat is the thing with the timer, exactly as we covered with cooking oils and nuts. Store it sealed with an oxygen absorber and holds not just safety, but flavor for decades. Left open in a humid kitchen, it clumps and picks up moisture fast. It's one of the more storage-sensitive items here. It's also more versatile than most people expect. Powdered milk works in baking, in sauces, and stirred into oatmeal or coffee, so it doesn't have to be drunk straight to earn its space, which matters because reconstituted powdered milk is the one part of this that most people genuinely don't love on its own. This one surprises people because coffee has such a strong reputation for going stale. Ground coffee genuinely does within weeks. Instant coffee is a completely different product. Freeze-dried instant coffee, sealed, keeps essentially indefinitely. 25 years is a conservative figure, and it's routinely cited as one of those items that outlasts its own container. The freeze-drying process removes the moisture that lets flavor compounds break down. The flavor does slowly fade over a long enough timeline, and nobody would claim a 20-year-old jar tastes like fresh brewed. But safe and drinkable, decades later, is genuinely the case. It also earns its place for a non-nutritional reason that we've talked about before: morale. A hot cup of something familiar has an outsized effect on whether people actually stick to eating from a stockpile, which makes cheap, decades-lasting coffee as smarter than its calorie count suggests. One distinction worth making at the store: spray-dried instant coffee, the cheaper powder type, doesn't hold up quite as well as true freeze-dried granules, which have a coarser, crystal-like look. Both store for years, but the freeze-dried version is the one that genuinely earns the decades-long claim. Bouillon cubes and powdered soup base are mostly salt, dried flavoring, and a small amount of fat. And that composition puts them solidly into long-term territory when sealed properly. Sealed and kept dry, they hold for many years, with the salt doing most of the preservation work. The small fat content is the limiting factor rather than the salt, which is why they're on this list, but not at the very top of it. What makes them genuinely valuable is leverage. A few cents of bouillon turns plain rice or beans into something that tastes like an actual meal, which is the same point we made about spices being the highest impact dollar in a budget pantry. The main enemy here is humidity. Bouillon absorbs moisture readily and turns into a solid block. Airtight storage isn't optional for this one, it's the whole game. Individually wrapped cubes have a real advantage over loose powder here, since each one stays sealed until the moment it's used, meaning a single humid exposure ruins one cube instead of the entire container, which is a genuinely better design for long-term storage, even if it costs slightly more per serving. Dried spices don't spoil in any meaningful sense. There's no moisture and essentially nothing for microbes to grow on. What they do is fade, losing the volatile oils that carry their aroma. Whole spices hold their potency dramatically longer than ground. Peppercorns, cinnamon sticks, and whole cumin can stay genuinely useful for many years, while pre-ground versions noticeably weaken within a year or two. So the long shelf life version of this category is specific. Buy whole, store sealed, and dark, grind as needed. That combination is what turns spices from a one-year item into a decades-long one. And it's worth the effort for the same reason bouillon is. The difference between a stockpile people actually eat and one they abandon is almost always flavor, not calories. Light is the underrated enemy in this category. The clear glass jars that look best on a counter are the worst storage choice, since ultraviolet light degrades the same volatile oils that time does. Opaque containers in a closed cabinet roughly double how long a spice stays worth using. Hardtack is flour, water, and salt, baked until nearly all moisture is gone. And it's one of the oldest deliberately long storage foods there is, with genuine museum specimens surviving well over a century. The reason it works is exactly the reason regular crackers don't. No fat, no leavening, and virtually no moisture. Ordinary snack crackers are fried or baked in oil, which puts them on a short rancidity clock, as we covered when talking about what not to stockpile. Hardtack is also genuinely simple to make at home from ingredients already in a long-term pantry: flour, water, salt, which makes it more of a technique than a purchase. Nobody eats it for pleasure, but as a shelf-stable carbohydrate that survives essentially forever and pairs with soup or broth, it's earned its place across a few centuries of use. The traditional way to eat it explains the design. It's meant to be broken up and softened in liquid rather than bitten into, which is why every historical account pairs it with soup, coffee, or stew. Treated as a thickener and a carbohydrate base instead of a snack, it stops being a novelty and starts being genuinely practical. Lentils belong on this list for a specific reason that separates them from most beans. They're smaller, they cook fast without soaking, and they carry real protein, roughly the same nutritional case as beans without the long cook time. Sealed properly, dried lentils and split peas store for 25 to 30 years, the same window as beans and rice, because the storage math is identical: dry, low fat, and sealed away from air and moisture. The honest caveat is the same one that applies to all very old legumes. After many years, they take progressively longer to cook and never quite soften the way fresh ones do. Safe, yes, but a pressure cooker becomes genuinely useful. That's also the practical reason to rotate even a decades-rated food. Not because it becomes dangerous, but because the version you actually enjoy eating is the fresher one. Red lentils deserve a specific mention as the fastest option in this whole category. They break down into a thick soup in roughly 15 minutes with no soaking at all, which makes them the best choice for any scenario where cooking fuel is limited, a genuinely different practical profile from beans that need an hour or more. Dried whole corn is a genuine long-term staple, and popcorn is the version most people already have in the pantry without realizing it stores for decades. Sealed away from moisture, Dried corn kernels hold 30 years or more. The intact hull does the same protective job that we described for wheat berries, keeping air and moisture away from the interior. Popcorn specifically is one of the best snack per dollar items that exists. A small jar of kernels produces an enormous volume of fresh snack for pennies, which is exactly why it beats a bag of chips both on price and on shelf life. One important distinction: cornmeal is ground corn, and grinding exposes the oils inside. That puts cornmeal on a roughly 1-year clock, not a 30-year one. Store the kernel, grind when you need it. Whole dried corn also has a second use most people never consider. Soaked in an alkaline solution, a traditional process called nixtamalization, it becomes hominy or masa for tortillas, which historically is exactly how corn-based cultures unlocked its full nutrition, since the process makes niacin in the grain available to the body. Sugar is one of the few items on this list that arguably has no expiration at all under proper storage. It's chemically inhospitable to bacteria and mold in the same way honey is. White sugar, sealed and kept dry, stores indefinitely. The failure mode isn't spoilage, it's clumping. Sugar absorbs moisture readily and can turn into a solid brick, which is annoying but not a safety problem and is easily broken up. Brown sugar hardens even faster because it contains molasses and more moisture to begin with. Still safe indefinitely, just more prone to turning into a rock if not sealed well. Beyond sweetening, sugar is genuinely functional in a long-term pantry. It's a preservative in its own right, essential for canning and jam making, and a dense source of quick calories. If a bag does turn into a solid block, there's a simple fix that costs nothing. Seal it overnight with a slice of bread or a damp paper towel in the container. The sugar pulls just enough moisture back to loosen, and it breaks apart normally the next morning. No need to throw any of it out. We touched on this before as the smarter alternative to storing flour, and it deserves its own place here. Whole wheat berries are the intact grain, hull and all, before anything has been ground or stripped away. Sealed properly, wheat berries store 30 years or more, while whole wheat flour, which contains the same nutrition in ground form, goes rancid within months because grinding exposes the oils in the germ. A hand grinder costs $20 or $30 and turns a 30-year staple into fresh flour on demand. That's the entire trade. A small piece of equipment converts a decades-long storage item into an everyday one. And if the grinder is ever the thing you don't have, wheat berries still cook whole into a porridge or sprout into greens. The ingredient stays useful even without the equipment. Which variety you buy matters more than most guides mention. Hard red wheat is higher in protein and makes better bread, while soft white wheat is milder and better suited to pastries and quick breads. Both store for the same 30-plus years, so it's worth picking based on what you'd actually bake rather than on price alone. Baking soda is a simple mineral compound, and minerals don't spoil. Sealed and kept dry, it stores indefinitely with no meaningful safety clock at all. What it does lose over time is potency for leavening. An old box may not rise a cake the way a fresh one will, which is why the common advice is to replace it every couple of years for baking specifically. There's an easy test for that. Drop a small amount into vinegar. Vigorous fizzing means it still has leavening power. A weak reaction means it's fine for cleaning, but no longer reliable for baking. And that's the other half of why it belongs in a long-term pantry. Even when it's past its leavening prime, it's still a cleaner, a deodorizer, and a basic first aid item. Genuinely multi-purpose in a way most food items aren't. Worth not confusing with baking powder, which is a different product entirely. Baking powder contains baking soda, plus an acid and often cornstarch, and that mixture genuinely does degrade within about a year. Baking soda is the one with no real clock. If only one goes in the long-term pantry, it's the soda. We covered this in the Shelf Life Myths video, and it's worth restating here, because it's the one food where last forever is closer to literal truth than exaggeration. Honey's low moisture and high acidity make it genuinely hostile to the bacteria and mold that spoil almost everything else. Archaeological finds have turned up edible honey thousands of years old, and the chemistry behind that is well understood. Crystallization is the only thing that reliably happens over time. It turns cloudy and grainy, which is a physical change, not spoilage, and gently warming the jar reverses it completely. The only real risk is moisture getting in through an unsealed lid or a wet spoon. The reputation depends on keeping it sealed, not on honey being magically immune to everything. Beans are the protein backbone of nearly every serious long-term food plan, and the numbers back that up. Sealed properly, dried beans store 25 to 30 years and stay safe throughout. They're also one of the best calorie and protein per dollar items in the entire grocery store, which is why they show up in every budget pantry build. Cheap, dense, and genuinely nutritious rather than just filling. The honest limitation is cooking time on very old beans. After a couple of decades, they can resist softening no matter how long they simmer, which is a real quality issue, even though it's not a safety one. A pressure cooker solves most of that, and rotating your oldest stock into regular meals solves the rest. The same first-in, first-out habit that makes any pantry actually work. Beans have a second capability worth knowing about. Many varieties will sprout, turning a dry storage staple into fresh greens with nothing but water and a jar. Sprouting ability does fade with age, while before it ability does, but it's a genuinely useful way to get fresh nutrition out of a pantry with no garden at all. White rice is the single most calorie-dense cheap staple most people can store, and sealed properly, it hits the same 25 to 30-year window as beans. The reason it works, and the reason brown rice doesn't, comes down to the brand. White rice has had the oily bran and germ stripped away, removing exactly the component that goes rancid within 6 to 12 months in brown rice. Store it in Mylar with an oxygen absorber or a sealed food-grade bucket, and it's about as close to a set-and-forget staple as food gets. Left in its original thin bag, the same rice is a 1 to 2 year gamble against pests and moisture. Paired with beans, it also forms a genuinely complete protein, which is why rice and beans has been a foundational combination in food cultures around the world for centuries, not just in prepper pantries. Parboiled rice, sometimes labeled converted, is worth knowing as a middle option. It's steamed before milling in a way that pushes some nutrients from the bran into the grain itself. So it keeps more nutrition than plain white while still storing far longer than brown. For anyone bothered by white rice's stripped-down nutrition, that's the compromise that doesn't sacrifice the shelf life. And at number 1, the food that outlasts everything else on this list, costs almost nothing, and is genuinely irreplaceable: plain salt. Salt is a mineral. It does not spoil, it does not go rancid, and it has no expiration date in any meaningful sense. A sealed container of plain salt stored today will be exactly as good in 50 years as it is now. Beyond seasoning, salt is a preservation tool in its own right. Curing, brining, and fermenting all depend on it, which means it's not just a food that lasts, it's a food that helps other food last. The one caution is clumping from humidity, and the fix is simply an airtight container. Iodized salt does slowly lose its added iodine over years, so plain or sea salt is the better long-term choice, with iodine coming from other foods in the diet. For a few dollars, salt is arguably the highest value item in any long-term pantry. Indefinite shelf life, genuinely essential to health, and useful for far more than flavor. So there you have it. 15 foods that genuinely last 25 years or more, and a single pattern connecting nearly all of them. Remove the moisture, remove the oil, and seal out the air, and food essentially stops having a clock. Notice how often storage did the heavy lifting rather than the food itself. White rice in a sealed bucket is a 30-year item. The same rice in its paper bag is a 1-year gamble. That gap between the food and how it's stored is where almost all the real shelf life lies. And a genuine reminder worth repeating: safe isn't the same as good. Most of these stay perfectly safe for decades while slowly losing texture, flavor, or nutrition, which is exactly why rotating your stock, eating what you store, and storing what you eat beats treating a pantry like a time capsule. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually worth stocking deep, hit subscribe. New pantry and grocery smart videos almost every day, real numbers, no fear-mongering. And tell me in the comments, which of these 15 do you already have, and which one are you adding this week? Stay stocked, stay smart, and I'll see you in the next one.